Today's session is called Approaches to International Political Economy, and once again we will look at these approaches in the context of the current COVID-19 pandemic. So we will use current examples to illustrate general approaches to international political economy. The session will be structured in 4 parts. In the first part, I will discuss the question, what is international political economy? After that, I will introduce you to the 3 classic paradigms in international political economy. I will then move on to briefly discuss the methods in international political economy, and finally close the lecture with some remarks on major transformations in the field as well as in the academic subject of international political economy. So, what is international political economy? Semantic interpretations of terms are often misleading, so it's not always a good idea to look at the meanings of individual words or part of a word to understand the meaning of a concept. But in the case of international political economy, it is actually helpful to look at the meaning of the 3 elements that the term is composed of. And it's even more helpful to begin at the end. So let's begin by asking, what is an economy and what is economics? If you look in an economics textbook, you typically find the definition of economy as being about the allocation of scarce resources. And what is a scarce resource? It's something where the amount available is limited so that not everybody who wants it can have it. And you typically think about maybe goods and services, so there are not as many smartphones as people who want smartphones. There are not as many haircuts as people who maybe need haircuts, and so on. But you also can think of other resources, and typically in the economy you talk about land, labor and capital in addition to goods and services. But you can also use this in any kind of other area. For example, let's say you didn't read the reading assignment for this week, and then I ask you, hey, why didn't you read it? And if you then say, well, I thought the class was only on Wednesday and now I'm surprised that it's on Tuesday and I simply forgot about it, then this is not an economic argument. But if I ask you the same question and you answer, well, I only had one weekend and I still had the entirety of Tiger King to watch, so I just didn't find the time, then you make an economic argument, because then your time is a scarce resource and you have to allocate it selectively. And then you decided to allocate it to Netflix rather than to O'Brien and Williams, which is kind of an economic choice. And this is one way to define economics, by looking at scarce resources. You can also have a more generalized definition of it. Then the economy is the system of the production, distribution and consumption of wealth. So it's not so easy to define what wealth is, but again, it might be stuff that makes life better, and the whole system in which this stuff is produced, distributed and consumed, that's the economy. And there is, of course, an academic discipline that is focused at these questions, and this is economics or maybe business studies. Then let's look at the second word in the term, political or politics. And here we have a narrower and a wider definition. In the narrow definition, politics is only referring to those activities associated to the governance of a community, generating and executing collectively binding norms. There are all kinds of norms in the world. For example, the norm that I say, please do your reading, but this is not collectively binding in the sense it is not enforced, and I will not call the police if you don't do the reading. However, there are norms that are collectively binding and enforced, and these norms we call laws. And so politics then is about the process in which these laws are created and then executed. And this, of course, refers strongly to the state as being the location of politics. And this is politics in the narrow sense. We can also have a much more wider definition of politics, and then politics refers to all kinds of struggles of interest and power. So we have certain actors who have certain interests and who have certain resources of power to push through their interests, and then they use certain strategies, and then these actors come into conflict. And all these processes, wherever they happen, be it in the state or being outside the state, be it in the seminar room, be it wherever, that's always called politics in the wide sense. And it's important to know both notions of politics, and it's important to distinguish them, and it's important to know of which one you're talking when you're talking, but both notions do make sense. And politics in this sense is studied in political science, of course. Before we move on to the first word in the term, we look at the combination of the last two words, which are politics and economics, or political economy. The thing with politics and economics is that they are strongly interrelated. So there won't be any economics without politics, and there won't be politics without economics. So the two are intertwined. And the term political economy refers to the totality of the economic system and the political system as they form the system of political economy together. And so if you look from a political economy perspective at politics, you particularly look at economic politics and social politics, because those are the politics with the strongest economic impact. And if you look with a political economy perspective at economics, you also particularly look at those aspects of economics that are closely related to politics. So you do not necessarily look at management strategies as long as they're not connected to politics. So this perspective aims at the connection of the two. And if you speak of political economy, you typically think of the national level, but you could also look at the local level, the regional level, or the global level. And the academic disciplines where this is studied is, on the one hand, political economy, which is oftentimes a subdivision of political science, or there's also a subdivision in economics departments where this is studied, which is parts of macroeconomics, because macroeconomics is the part of economics where you look at entire economic systems, where political economy is an important aspect. So let's then look at the first word in the term international political economy, which is international, or if we speak of global political economy, then it's global. The word international refers to anything that transcends national borders. For example, if you travel from Tuebingen to Berlin, you're not doing international travel. But if you're traveling from Tuebingen to Paris, which you're not allowed to do at the moment, then you're traveling internationally. Secondly, international also refers to processes that happen between two countries, or the relations between two countries. So the relations between India and Australia are international relations. The term global is a little bit more demanding, because then it does not only require for the thing you talk about to transcend the border between two nations, but it has to affect the whole world, or almost the whole world. So if you're traveling from Tuebingen to Paris, that's international travel, but it's not yet global travel. And of course, these concepts are much more abstract than the ones I discussed before, yet you could say that questions of internationality are, for example, discussed in international relations, which of course is a subfield of political science, or also in international economics, which is a subfield of economics. So finally, what is the international or global political economy? And as you probably will have guessed by now, this is the totality of politics and economics on an international or global scale, which once again means that international politics and international economics are strongly interrelated. And if you look at both of them as one common system and focus on the interrelation, focus on how international politics affect international economics and how international economics affect international politics, then you're looking at international political economy. And the field in which this is done is either called international political economy or global political economy. The terms are typically interchangeable. For example, 3 years ago, I was teaching global political economy at the University of Kassel. Now I'm teaching international political economy at the University of Tübingen. I'm teaching the same stuff at both universities, but the universities use different names, and that's basically the difference. The last thing I want to highlight is the use of the definite article and the capitalization of letters in the term. If you ask what's new in the international political economy and you use lowercase letters, then you are referring to stuff that's happening outside in the world. For example, a decline of world trade between 13 and 32%. If, however, you ask what's new in international political economy and you use capital letters, then you're referring to stuff that's happening within the academic discipline. For example, a new edition of a journal being published or some change at some university department. I hope by now it has become clear that international political economy is an interdisciplinary venture that is between political science and economics, and in order to understand it, you have to combine knowledge from both disciplines. But this is not yet enough, because there is also knowledge from other disciplines that is highly relevant in our field. One of them is sociology, because all processes of politics and economics are always embedded in society and social relations in a wider sense. So you oftentimes have to include perspectives from sociology. And another discipline that has been becoming more and more important to international political economy over the course of the last couple of years is geography, because processes of international political economy are often affected by the geographic context in which they are happening. The most obvious example maybe is the economic history of Britain or England or the United Kingdom or all of them, which is strongly affected by the fact that all of this happened on an island. So what questions could we ask from these different perspectives in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic? If we take an economics perspective, then we could, for example, ask how are scarce resources allocated within this crisis? And what are scarce resources right now? Obviously, it's treatment, it's testing, it's protective gear, and it's toilet paper. And so we can ask, who will receive these scarce resources? For example, who will receive a coronavirus test? Is it a person who has symptoms? Is it a person who is in high risk of dying if they get the disease? Is it a person who is working in the healthcare sector and therefore would really want to know if they have it? Or is it someone who's just like really important as a person, for example, a soccer player, so we want to know if they're positive or not? How are these resources allocated? This is obviously economics if you take this perspective. You can also take a broader view and ask, how are businesses, employees, and producers affected by this crisis? Or you can ask, how are certain resources or certain forms of labor re-evaluated? So do we value bread higher than we would have 10 weeks ago? And would we value the work of a healthcare worker or a supermarket cashier higher than we would have 10 weeks ago? And is this also reflected in their payment or not? These are obviously economic questions. If we take a political science perspective, we can ask, how do states and other political actors react to the pandemic, and do they interact, fight, cooperate, and negotiate? And here we can, for example, look at states. We can also look at different ministries within a state, so different state apparatuses. Does the Ministry of Economics have different stance than the Ministry of Health? We can also look at how labor unions and business organizations react, what their demands are their demands the same, do they have conflict, and how are the final decisions made? And this is obviously the politics of the crisis. When it comes to political economy, we can, for example, ask how the political economic structure of a country shapes the response of that country. For example, we can look at the strong welfare states of Northern Europe on the one hand and the rather free market economy of the United States on the other hand. And all of these countries are roughly as rich as one another, but yet the means they have to stabilize the economy are very, very different. And for example, the statistics about American unemployment I showed you before, we don't see this in Northern Europe. And this is because Northern Europe has a different kind of welfare state, and the labor market is much more strongly regulated than the United States. So there are differences, obviously, that result from the political economic structure of the country. We can also ask this question the other way around and ask, how is the political economic structure of a country affected by the crisis? So, for example, will the United States, after this crisis, see that they should really change their health insurance system? This is one possibility. It's not certain, but it might happen, and we can look at these kind of questions. And finally, we can also ask the questions how states and other political actors react to the economic effects of the crisis. So not so much how do they try to contain or mitigate the disease itself, but how do they react to job loss and so on. If we take an international relations perspective, we can ask how the states interact, fight, cooperate, and negotiate in their reactions to the pandemic. And we can ask, what role do international organizations play? In the last couple of days, for example, we've seen some kind of blame game, mainly started from the United States, who were first blaming the European countries and China, and then they also started blaming the World Health Organization, and also decided to defund the World Health Organization, so the United States do no longer pay their contribution to this organization of the United Nations, and all of these are questions of international relations. Finally, if we look at the international political economy of the COVID-19 pandemic, we can ask how the whole structure of the international political economy will be affected or transformed by the crisis. So again, will there be a deglobalization? Will globalization continue as we knew it? Will international production change? Will production chains change? Will there be as much trade as there was before? And so on and so on. And here again, we can ask how the states act and interact, and what role international organizations are playing and will play. Will the International Monetary Fund, for example, give money to Iran, which they applied for, but which until now has not happened? And these are also international political economy questions.